He returned from the war and found his house destroyed and his family gone. But it was his old dog that showed him what changed everything. Watch this story to the end, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments which city you are from. The morning sun rose slowly over the two-lane highway, spilling a pale gold across the cracked asphalt and the long, empty fields of late autumn. Michael Reed drove with one hand resting loosely on the wheel, the other hanging out the window, feeling the cold air cut through his fingers. The truck was old, the kind that rattled at every bump, but it still ran as steadily as it had when he bought it 15 years ago. Beside him, on the worn passenger seat, lay a black German shepherd with a graying muzzle and calm, alert eyes. Her name was Shadow. She had been with him longer than most people ever stayed through dust, through silence, through the desert heat and the hum of helicopters. He had not said a word for miles. There was nothing to say. The radio didn't work, and even if it did, he didn't want music. He just wanted to reach the small house at the end of the county road, the one he hadn't seen in years, the one that still lived in his memory as it had been. White porch, neat fence, the laughter of his daughter drifting from the swing under the old oak tree. The closer he got, the more everything seemed to age around him. Mailboxes leaned sideways, paint peeled from the sides of barns, windows were boarded up. Time had slowed here, maybe even stopped, while he'd been gone. He pressed his foot lightly on the gas as the road narrowed, and the truck rumbled into the outskirts of what used to be his town. A faded grocery sign hung crooked over a shuttered storefront. The gas station was gone, replaced by a rusted skeleton of pumps and weeds pushing through the concrete. Shadow stirred beside him, her tail tapping twice against the seat, before she sat up and looked out the window. "Yeah," he said quietly. "We're almost there." His voice sounded strange, foreign even to himself, unused for too long, except for commands and whispers meant for survival. When he turned onto the old dirt lane, his chest tightened. The house came into view, and for a moment he thought he had taken a wrong turn. The place was hardly recognizable. The porch steps sagged inward, the shutters hung crooked, and the yard had grown wild. What used to be bright white paint had dulled into the color of old bones. The mailbox still read, "Reed," but the letters were barely visible under a layer of rust. He parked the truck in front and killed the engine. Silence filled the air so thickly that even the ticking of cooling metal sounded loud. Shadow jumped down first, sniffing the ground, tail held low but steady. Michael followed slowly, his boots crunching on the gravel. The smell hit him first. Damp wood, dust, and something faintly sour, like forgotten things. The door was boarded shut with a single plank of wood nailed across it. He stood there a long time, staring at it, unable to move. Someone, maybe a neighbor, must have sealed it after he'd been declared missing. He touched the edge of the board, feeling the rough splinters under his fingers, and then looked at Shadow. The dog sat beside him, watching, waiting for his decision. "All right, girl," he murmured. "Let's go home." He pried the board off and turned the key that still fit the lock. The hinges moaned as the door opened. A wave of stale air rolled out, thick with the scent of neglect. Dust motes floated in the weak light that entered from the hallway window. He stepped inside and stopped. The living room looked as if someone had started packing and never finished. Furniture was pushed against the walls, picture frames face down, a broken vase lying near the door. His boots left tracks in the layer of dust that coated the floor. On the coffee table lay a child's drawing, a stick figure family of 3, and a dog colored with faded crayons. He traced the line of the small figure with the blue dress. "Sarah," he whispered, the name breaking the silence like glass. Shadow padded softly from room to room, her nails clicking against the wood, her nose working constantly. She sniffed the corners, paused near the stairs, then trotted toward the kitchen. Michael followed her, the boards creaking beneath his weight. The kitchen was worse. Cabinet doors hung open, dishes stacked haphazardly in the sink, a cup still standing on the counter with a ring of dried coffee at the bottom. On the wall calendar, the last marked date was 5 years ago. He leaned against the counter and closed his eyes. His wife Linda's handwriting filled his memory lists, notes, the way she wrote grocery reminders with looping letters. He could almost see her standing there, hair tied up, humming while she stirred something on the stove. He opened his eyes again, but the room remained empty, stripped of warmth. Shadow barked once, low and sharp, drawing him toward the hallway. She stood at the base of the stairs, her head tilted slightly, staring at something under the narrow table by the wall. Michael crouched and reached beneath it, pulling out a small shoe pink with faded sparkles, the kind a little girl would wear to school. The dust on it told him it had been there for years. He sat down on the floor, the shoe in his hand, and Shadow pressed her head against his arm. For a long while he just sat there. The ticking of an old wall clock somewhere upstairs was the only sound. Time had gone on without him. He didn't know where they had gone or why the house was left in this state. Maybe they had waited until waiting became unbearable. When the light outside began to fade, he found himself standing in front of the fireplace. The old bricks were cold, but there was still a box of matches on the mantel. He gathered some logs from the porch, cleared the ashes, and lit a small fire. It caught slowly, filling the room with the first flicker of warmth he'd felt in years. Shadow circled once and lay down beside the hearth, her tail curling over her paws. Michael lowered himself into the armchair opposite the fire, the springs groaning softly under his weight. He looked around the room, the framed photographs, their glass fogged with grime. He reached for one and wiped it clean. It showed Linda, smiling, with Sarah on her lap and Shadow between them. They looked so alive, so unaware of how easily life could split apart. He placed the photograph back on the mantel and stared into the flames. The orange light painted the room in shades of memory. He thought about the years overseas, the endless deserts, the echoing noise that had followed him even into sleep. He had imagined this moment, the homecoming so many times, but never like this. Never empty. He glanced down at Shadow. Her eyes were half closed, her breathing steady. She had been his constant in a world that shifted without warning. He reached down and touched her fur, rough and warm. "Guess it's just you and me again," he murmured. Outside, the wind rose, brushing against the loose shutters. The house creaked, as if adjusting to his presence. For a brief moment, he felt something like peace. Not comfort, but the beginning of it. The fire crackled softly. The air no longer smelled of dust, but of smoke and wood, something clean and alive. He stayed awake long after the flames dimmed, watching the light fade into embers. In the quiet, he imagined footsteps upstairs, the sound of his daughter's laughter, the soft hum of Linda's voice. They weren't real, but he didn't chase them away. It was enough to know the walls remembered. When at last he rose to go to bed, he found that Shadow had followed him to the foot of the stairs. She waited there until he climbed halfway up, then settled herself on the rug as if to keep watch. He paused and looked back down at her, a faint smile crossing his face. "Good girl," he said. "Keep an eye on things." In the small bedroom, the air was colder. The bedspread was still the same pattern Linda had chosen, blue with white stitching, but it was stiff with time. He sat on the edge, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. The day had been long, heavier than any he'd known in uniform. And yet, for the first time in years, he was home. As he lay down, the faint crackle of the fire downstairs reached him through the quiet. Shadow's breathing echoed softly from below. His last thought before sleep took him was that the house wasn't dead. It was only waiting for someone to remember how to live inside it. Outside, The wind eased. The moon rose over the field, silvering the roof, the porch, the open door. Inside, the veteran and his dog slept in a house that had finally begun to breathe again. When Michael woke, the house was cold again. The fire had gone out some time before dawn, leaving the faint smell of ash in the air. For a moment he did not remember where he was, only that the bed was too soft, the silence too heavy. Then Shadow's nails clicked faintly on the floor below, and everything came rushing back: the road, the boarded door, the shoe under the table, the hollow quiet of rooms that once held laughter. He sat up slowly, rubbed his eyes, and listened to the stillness. He went downstairs barefoot, the boards cold under his feet. Shadow stood near the back door, her tail moving slightly from side to side. When she saw him, she gave a short, sharp bark and looked back toward the yard. "All right," he said softly, opening the door. The morning light was pale and cold. The yard was hardly a yard anymore, just a wild patch of grass and weeds where flowers had once been. The swing under the oak had fallen, its ropes frayed to strings. Everything smelled of damp earth and neglect. Shadow trotted out ahead, nose to the ground, moving with purpose. Michael followed her, wrapping his jacket tighter around himself. The dog stopped near the far end of the yard, where the ground dipped slightly beneath the old oak tree. She began to dig, the dirt flying in quick, eager bursts. "Hey, what is it?" he asked, but she didn't stop. Something in the way she worked made him crouch beside her and brush away the soil with his own hands. After a few minutes, he hit something solid, a corner of rusted metal. He cleared the dirt around it, revealing an old army tin box, the kind he had used himself years ago to store letters and photographs during deployment. His name wasn't on it. Still, his fingers trembled as he lifted it from the ground. He sat back on the grass and unlatched the lid. Inside lay a small rubber ball, discolored and cracked with age. Several folded pieces of paper that turned out to be children's drawings, and beneath them, a letter sealed in a plastic bag. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Linda's. For a long moment he couldn't open it. The air around him seemed to thin until he could hear only the beating of his own heart and the soft panting of Shadow beside him. When he finally unfolded the paper, the ink was faded, but still legible. "We didn't know if you were alive. I tried to be strong for Sarah, but the waiting hollowed everything. The house turned into a museum of silence. Every day I set the table for 3, and every night I cleared one plate away. I wanted to believe you'd come back, but belief stopped being enough. If you ever return, please live. Don't search for us. Don't carry the weight of our waiting. We loved you, but we couldn't stay buried in the past." The words blurred. He blinked, but no tears came, only the dull ache of something too deep to cry over. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside, and sat there until the wind grew colder. Shadow pressed her head against his knee, letting out a low whine. "It's all right," he whispered. "It's all right, girl." But it wasn't. That night he didn't build a fire. He sat in the dark with the box on the table, the letter open in front of him, and the old ball beside it. The ball still carried faint marks from a child's handwriting. Sarah had written her name on it with a black marker years ago. He remembered her laughter when it bounced too far, and Shadow sprinted after it, triumphant every time she returned it. The memory hurt more than the letter. The next morning he rose early. Something had changed. Some part of him that had been paralyzed was awake again. He moved through the house slowly, opening every door, every drawer, forcing himself to see the damage rather than avoid it. Dust, broken furniture, cracked window panes. It was all real, all fixable. He went to the garage. The old toolbox was still there, red paint chipped, the hinges rusted but usable. He found a hammer, a handful of nails, sandpaper. The rhythm of repair came back to him easily. At first his hands were clumsy, but soon he was working as if the act of mending wood could steady his own breath. Shadow followed him everywhere. When he dragged a broken chair outside to fix, she sat nearby, head tilted as though supervising. When he climbed the ladder to patch the gutter, she barked each time the metal clanked, as if reminding him to be careful. At noon, he paused to eat a sandwich, made from the last of the stale bread he'd found in the pantry. Shadow lay beside him, resting her head on his boot. They didn't need words. Her steady presence was enough. By the end of the first week, the kitchen looked different. The floor was clean, the counters scrubbed, the windows clear. It was still a ghost of what it once had been, but it was breathing again. He even found a rhythm in it. Wake at sunrise, feed Shadow, work until the light faded. Every nail he drove into the wood felt like stitching something back together, though he couldn't yet name what. One afternoon, while cleaning the living room, he found the photograph he had wiped the night before, still standing on the mantel. He took it down again and studied the faces. Linda's eyes, warm and tired. Sarah's smile. And Shadow, younger, her coat still dark and glossy. He spoke aloud without thinking, his voice rough from disuse. "We're getting there. You'd like it here again." The dog looked up at the sound of his voice and came to sit beside him. She nudged the frame with her nose, then settled down on the rug. For a long time he sat next to her, staring into the fire that he'd rebuilt that evening. The days blurred, filled with work. He patched the porch, replaced broken glass, and cleared the path to the gate. He found himself talking more, mostly to Shadow, about small things, the weather, the stubbornness of old wood. It felt strange but necessary, like keeping language alive after years of silence. Sometimes at night, when the fire dimmed, he would tell her stories about Sarah, about the time she painted the dog's tail pink, or the summer they built a fort out of blankets. Shadow would tilt her head, listening, her ears twitching at the sound of her name. Yet each improvement brought its own ache. Fixing the stairs reminded him of how Sarah used to slide down the railing, laughing as Linda pretended to scold her. Repairing the back fence reminded him of the day they brought Shadow home, a small pup with paws too big for her body. The memories came uninvited, but he didn't push them away. He realized that if he wanted this house to live again, he couldn't erase what it had been. At the end of one long day, he stood in the yard as the sun sank behind the trees. The house glowed faintly in the orange light. It wasn't beautiful yet, not even close, but it was standing. Shadow walked slowly toward him, carrying something in her mouth. It was a piece of cloth part of an old doll's dress, pink and torn. She dropped it at his feet and looked up expectantly. He picked it up, the fabric soft with age. "Where'd you find this?" he asked. Shadow wagged her tail once and trotted toward the shed, glancing back to make sure he followed. Inside, under a pile of boxes, he found what was left of Sarah's toy stuffed animals, blocks, a small wooden horse. Everything was coated in dust, but they were intact. He carried them back inside and cleaned each one carefully, lining them up on a shelf in the hallway. When night came, he built a fire again. The smell of burning wood filled the room, warm and familiar. He sat on the floor beside Shadow, scratching behind her ear. "We're doing all right," he said quietly. "A little more each day." The dog's eyes closed, her tail thumped once against the floor. Later, lying in bed, he thought about Linda's letter. "If you ever return, please live." The words had sounded like a farewell when he read them. Now they felt like a challenge. Living wasn't just breathing. It was fixing the roof before the rain came, cooking dinner for one, and sharing it with a dog who had waited just as long as he had. Weeks passed in this rhythm. The seasons began to tilt toward winter. Each morning, frost silvered the grass outside, and Shadow's breath came out in faint clouds. The house no longer smelled of neglect. It smelled of paint, of pine, of coffee again. He hung clean curtains in the kitchen window, and one evening, as he washed the last brush, he caught his reflection in the glass. He hardly recognized the man staring back. Older, yes, but awake. On the mantel he arranged the family photographs again. Some frames were cracked, but he kept them. At the far end, he left one frame empty. He didn't know what picture would fill it yet, but he believed there would be one. That night, when he sat by the fire with Shadow's head resting on his knee, the house was quiet in a different way. Not hollow, but settled, like an exhale after a long breath held too long. He realized then that he was no longer trying to restore what had been lost. He was building something new out of what remained. He reached down, picked up the old rubber ball from the box, and tossed it gently across the room. Shadow blinked, surprised for an instant, then pushed herself up and went after it, her movements slow but sure. When she brought it back, tail wagging faintly, Michael smiled for the first time in years. Outside, frost covered the yard, shining under the moonlight. Inside, the fire burned steady. The veteran and his old companion sat together in the glow, surrounded by walls that no longer felt abandoned. The letter lay folded in the drawer, its ache softened by time, its meaning rewritten by quiet persistence. The house was no longer a monument to what was gone. It had become a place where life, in its simplest form, had learned to begin again. The days moved quietly after that, one folding into the next with the slow rhythm of ordinary work. The cold deepened, brushing the mornings with frost that glimmered over the grass and the rooftops. Michael had grown used to the stillness, to the sound of his own footsteps echoing through the rooms, to the gentle shuffle of Shadow following him everywhere he went. He no longer flinched when the floor creaked or when wind passed through the chimney. The house had learned his sounds again, just as he had learned its silence. Each morning he made coffee on the old stove, the kettle hissing softly, while the first light crept through the windows. He would drink it standing by the back door, looking out at the yard that he and Shadow had slowly reclaimed from wildness. The weeds had been cut, the swing now hung straight, and the fence no longer leaned into the earth. It was a modest patch of land, nothing special, but it was theirs again. Shadow would sit by his side, watching the same horizon with patient eyes, and he often wondered if she remembered it as he did. He had stopped counting the weeks since his return. There was comfort in the routine, fixing, cleaning, tending to small things. It wasn't the life he once imagined for himself, but it was real, and for the first time in years, that was enough. Yet there were moments when the quiet pressed too close, when the emptiness of the rooms reminded him that repair alone could not fill the space left behind. In those moments, he would reach for the letter, unfold it once more, and read the same words under the same lamplight. If you ever return, please live. It was no longer an echo of loss. It was a command he was learning to obey. Shadow had grown slower. Her steps were heavier now, her breathing deeper, sometimes wheezing when she climbed the porch stairs. He noticed it one morning when she didn't follow him outside right away. She remained by the fireplace, half asleep, until he called her twice. When she finally joined him, she walked with a measured gait, but her tail still lifted when she saw him smile. He began to understand that their time was running out, and that realization brought with it a tenderness he could barely hold. Every evening he brushed her fur by the fire, speaking softly to her about nothing at all. She listened with the same steady patience as always. One evening, as he was sweeping the front porch, he found a small notebook wedged behind the coat rack near the door. Its cover was cracked and faded, but when he opened it, he saw Linda's handwriting. Most of the pages were blank, but the first few contained phone numbers, recipes, reminders for bills, small traces of an ordinary life. He turned to the last written page and saw something that made his breath catch. It was a note addressed simply to M. It said, "I don't know what to say anymore. The waiting has become a kind of living, but I can't tell Sarah to keep believing forever. If you come back, you'll know where to find us." Beneath the words was a single line of numbers, a phone number he didn't recognize. He closed the notebook slowly and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The evening light slanted through the window, touching the page as if it too remembered. The decision came quietly, without any grand resolve. He stood, went to the phone on the counter, and dialed. The first ring seemed to last forever. On the third, a woman's voice answered, tentative, cautious. "Hello?" The sound was older than he remembered, but unmistakably hers. He couldn't speak at first. The air caught in his throat, and Shadow, hearing his silence, lifted her head. "Linda," he said finally, the word breaking softly. There was a pause, and then a small intake of breath. "Michael?" Her voice trembled on his name. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet between them felt like the ocean, vast, impossible, but alive. "I came back," he said. "The house, it's still here. I fixed what I could." "I heard," she whispered. "The neighbors told me someone was there, but I didn't believe it. I didn't know if I could." "I found your letter," he said, "in the yard, under the oak." Another pause, longer this time. He could hear the faint hum of traffic on her end, the sound of life continuing somewhere else. "Sarah's grown," Linda said at last. "She's in college now. She doesn't know how to feel about any of this. She thought it was too late." "It isn't," he said, though his voice wavered on the words. "If she wants to see me, the door's open. The house is ready. I'll tell her," Linda said quietly. Then, after a moment, "Take care of yourself, Michael." When the line went dead, he stood there for a while, the receiver heavy in his hand. Shadow came to sit beside him, pressing her body against his leg. He looked down at her, smiled faintly, and whispered, "We did what we could." The next days passed with a strange lightness. He didn't expect anything, yet he caught himself glancing toward the road more often than before. He spent hours tending the garden, repairing the shutters again, even though they no longer needed it. It wasn't hope that kept him busy, not exactly. It was readiness, the quiet kind that expects nothing but stays open all the same. A week later, just before dusk, the sound of an engine drifted up the lane. Michael straightened slowly, wiping his hands on a rag. Shadow lifted her head, ears pricked, tail thumping once against the porch. The truck came into view, a small silver car that stopped at the gate. For a moment, no one got out. Then the driver's door opened, and a young woman stepped onto the gravel. She was tall, her hair caught by the wind, and for an instant he saw her as she had been, a little girl running across the yard, laughing as the dog chased her. Now she stood still, uncertain, her eyes searching the house. He didn't move. It was Shadow who broke the spell. The old dog rose slowly and started toward the gate, her tail wagging in uneven circles. The woman's hand went to her mouth. She knelt down as Shadow reached her, and the years between them dissolved in a single instant. "Shadow," she whispered, her voice breaking, and the dog pressed against her, whining softly, tail brushing the ground. Michael stood on the porch, the fading light behind him. He felt rooted to the spot, every heartbeat loud in his ears. When Sarah finally looked up, their eyes met across the yard. She didn't rush forward. She just stood, taking him in. The face older, the shoulders stooped, but the same eyes that had once watched her take her first steps. Then she started walking toward him, Shadow trotting between them as if to guide the way. At the foot of the steps, she stopped. "Dad," she said simply. He nodded, unable to speak. When she climbed the last step, she hesitated, then reached out. He took her hand. It was warm, alive, and trembling. They went inside together. He had prepared a simple meal bread, soup, the kind of food that didn't need words. They sat at the table in the soft glow of the lamp. Shadow lay at their feet, breathing heavily, her tail tapping occasionally against the floor. Sarah looked around, her gaze touching every repaired corner, every picture on the wall. "You fixed it," she said. "I had to," he replied. "It wouldn't let me leave it like it was. It feels the same," she whispered, "but different too. Like it's been waiting." "It has," he said. "So have I." For a long while they just ate quietly. Then she began to tell him about her life college, the city, the things she remembered from before. He listened, sometimes smiling, sometimes looking at his hands. When she finished, she asked about the war, and he told her only what she needed to know, that it was long, that it had taken more than it gave. Later, when the plates were cleared and the fire burned low, Sarah rose and went to the mantel. She looked at the photographs, her mother's face, her own childhood frozen in time, and the empty frame beside them. She turned to him and said, "We should take a new one." He nodded, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice when he agreed. They set the old camera on the table, angled toward the hearth. Michael sat in his chair, Shadow between them, Sarah leaning close so their shoulders touched. The timer clicked. For a moment the world was still, and then the flash went off, freezing them in that brief, perfect balance between past and present. Afterward, as Sarah prepared to leave for the night, she knelt again to hug the dog. Shadow's breathing was shallow, her eyes half closed. "She's tired," Sarah whispered. "She's earned her rest," Michael said. When the car disappeared down the lane, he stood on the porch until the sound of the engine faded completely. The night was cold, but the stars were sharp above him, and the house behind him glowed faintly through the windows. Inside, Shadow had already curled up by the fire. He went to her, sat on the floor, and rested a hand on her side. Her breathing was slow but steady. The firelight flickered over the new photograph on the mantel. 3 figures, father, daughter, and dog, caught in the warm haze of the room. He watched it until the lines blurred, not from sadness, but from the quiet weight of peace. For the first time since returning, he didn't feel like a visitor in his own home. The walls no longer pressed inward, and the silence was no longer heavy. It was simply the sound of rest. Shadow sighed in her sleep, her tail twitching once, and Michael smiled. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, soft and low, carrying with it the smell of wood smoke and the faint promise of snow. Inside, a man and his dog sat before the fire in a house that, after years of absence, had finally remembered how to breathe. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Watch our other stories. Each one carries a truth worth hearing. And if this video touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to see it today.